O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
It's 19 pages, The Real Wild West. Here are 10 of what I would consider the biggest misconceptions of the Wild West. One is that everyone carried guns. Kind of obvious. Not everyone had guns or carried them. And like I said, many places like Tombstone and Dodge City required people to check their guns. And so mostly only lawmen had guns in these major boomtown cities. But there was a lot of vigilantes and crime and robberies and stuff like that. So there is a significant degree of truth. The second one was the West was constantly lawless and violent. It was, but not as bad as Hollywood depicts it. While there was violence in the Wild West, most towns were not as chaotic or lawless as commonly depicted. That's what I found. Vigilantism did occur, but it wasn't the norm, and many towns had established law enforcement to maintain order, so usually a sheriff of some sort. Number three was that cowboys spent most of their time in gunfights or brawls. That's the way, again, Hollywood depicts it, but really not the case. Based on what I was finding, the average life or the average day of a cowboy was primarily very hard work, herding cattle, long days on horseback. Cowboys spent most of their time on ranches or on the trail moving cattle to market. And we're talking about, hundreds, if not sometimes a thousand some heads of cattle moving across hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so they did have gunfights or brawls, and cowboys often abided by a sort of unwritten code. There was like an unwritten personal code amongst cowboys. Number four is that Native Americans were constantly attacking settlers. Actually, what I found is that some of these conflicts weren't until more later in the Wild West period, that at least in the beginning stages, there was a lot of bartering. And so we've seen this in movies where the white man comes and he has like guns and alcohol, and then the Native Americans have maybe herbs and blankets or stuff like this. And that generally seemed to be the case. Obviously, the Indians did attack some of the pioneers. So some I was reading is that they would deliberately try to travel in very large packs, because if you were a single family and you were traveling to the west, you were much more likely to be picked off and potentially killed by Native Americans. Where if there was a very large caravan of horses and wagons, that they would tend to leave it alone, because after a while, the settlers began to form these perimeters where they would, once they saw the Native Americans coming, they would circle up, everybody would get in the center, and all the men with guns would get on the edges, and they would then shoot outwards in a circle towards the Indians, and it was quite effective. So that's one of the reasons that the Native Americans actually did not attack these large caravans as often. There were cases, though. Settlers were mostly men looking for adventure. Not exactly the case. I found, contrary to the myth of the lone male frontiersman, which there were some, but many settlers were actually families moving west to establish farms and start new lives. And women and children made up a significant portion of the Western migration. Women played essential roles in settlement communities, managing households, helping with farming and other stuff. And so I was listening to Mark Gardner, the historian we just saw, talking about the land deeds. And another thing that I thought was really interesting is that basically at that point, there was basically a law that you could go claim like 160 acres. You could go find a piece of land, and then you had to build a structure that was large enough. So they had requirements on the size of the structure. So if you're able to build basically a large enough house on 160 acres, and you had witnesses say that you lived there and you stayed there for a significant period of time, you essentially began to own it. And I thought that was pretty cool in regards to being able to just go out west, find yourself 160 acres, 200 acres. You kind of start pinpointing your property lines. You build a big enough house, and now you can, by law, say that is your property. Yeah, the Homestead Act. Well, I'm going to bring that up in just a minute, Bitterklinger. So thank you very much for mentioning that. And then outlaws were the most famous and influential people in the West. Not exactly. What I found is they were often considered nuisances or threats by the local communities. And influential figures in the West included landowners, entrepreneurs, railroad tycoons, and politicians who were instrumental in developing the actual infrastructure to these various towns and settlements. And then 7, the West was full of cowboys and wide-brimmed hats, boots, and spurs. The iconic cowboy uniform popularized in movies. Cowboys were practical clothing, as I showed you in that actual article that I showed you what a cowboy often looked like. And so the sort of Hollywood iconic, that is more towards the end of the Wild Western period, but not everybody dressed like that. And the Wild West lasted for a long time. The era of the Wild West, relatively short. It lasted roughly from the end of the Civil War. That's my take. Again, as we saw, some people define it differently. Lewis and Clark, 1803, Louisiana Purchase, before the Civil War, Transcontinental Railroad. I think you really see the outward movement of people as post-Civil War. And often Confederate soldiers, because of the violence and the animosity towards the Union after the end of the war, they could not stomach living under the Union and living under the sort of American regime, and that thousands of these men just decided that to just sell everything they own, or if they had some money, buy what they needed and just travel west. So again, a little piece of info that I found. And then everyone was out to strike it rich. Certainly the gold rush was significant. While some were drawn to the West by the promise of gold, and I saw something in regards to one of the articles in a local newspaper in San Francisco that made its way East Coast. They made it sound like gold was just sitting on the ground. Like if you went out to San Francisco, like you were bound to find gold, which was not the case at all. It was very arduous and diligent work to mine and try to find this gold, but people did, that's for sure. And so the gold rush of 1849 attracted thousands of people, but only a few actually struck it rich. The majority of settlers who moved out west, ordinary people hoping to build sustainable lives for themselves and their families, often through hard work and perseverance. And then the cowboys and Native Americans were constantly at war, although there is some reality, obviously, to those tensions. Cowboys and Native Americans were not constantly fighting. In fact, many cowboys and settlers had peaceful relationships with Native tribes. That was one of the interesting things I found, is how some of these cowboys, especially more prominent ones, would be able to speak the languages of 2 or 3 different tribes and had very cordial relationships with them. So they were not usually involved in direct conflicts with Native American tribes. These conflicts were generally between the U.S. Army and Native Americans, and due to land disputes. So a little interesting thing there. Now, in regards to some famous figures, now some of these I'm going to bring up in the outlaw section I have, but obviously Wild Bill Hickok, 1837 to 1876. He was born as James Butler Hickok in Illinois. Wild Bill Hickok gained fame as a legendary gunslinger, Union soldier, lawman, and scout. Known for his exceptional marksmanship, he became one of the first Wild West icons. Life and legacy: Hickok served in various roles, including scout for the Union Army, as a lawman in Kansas and Nebraska. His skill with firearms and his many tales of shootouts made him a mythical figure. His famous death, shot from behind while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota, holding a hand of 2 aces and 2 8s, known as the dead man's hand, which is still very common in Western movies. You'll see somebody playing poker and they'll tip up their cards and you'll see 2 black aces and 2 black 8s, usually is how I've seen it. And this is, again, the dead man's hand that a gentleman shot Wild Bill Hickok from behind in the head while playing poker. And Hickok's life and death exemplify the lawlessness and mythology of the Wild West. His reputation as a fearless lawman and gunslinger helped shape the archetype of the American cowboy hero and symbolize both violence and romance of the frontier life. Buffalo Bill Cody, again, I'll read this section. I'm not going to go too much into it. He wasn't one of my favorite, most interesting figures, but certainly an interesting historical figure nonetheless. He kind of died in poverty, almost bankrupt. But they made it all the way to Europe. Here, I'll read my section. I'm getting ahead of myself. Born William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill grew up on the frontier and worked as a scout Pony Express rider and buffalo hunter. His hunting skills earned him the nickname Buffalo Bill. He was incredible at, again, killing the buffalo, which actually decimated the buffalo population. I'm talking thousands and thousands of buffaloes. They were killed, and that's how he got his name. Cody rose to fame through his Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which traveled across America and Europe. He actually received letters from the King of England and the King of Germany at the time when he was towards the end of his life, when he was bankrupt. And he was showcasing a romanticized version of the Wild West. The shows included reenactments of battles, buffalo hunts, and Native American dances with performers like sharpshooter Annie Oakley, who we introduced. Cody was also advocated for Native American rights later in his life, and his shows helped preserve aspects of Native culture in the public's imagination. Buffalo Bill was instrumental in shaping public perception of the Wild West. His shows popularized Western culture worldwide and laid a groundwork for the Western genre in film and literature. This is where many of these sort of aesthetics of Hollywood, they get it from his Wild West shows. Annie Oakley, we kind of introduced her. She was born Phoebe Ann Moses in Ohio to a fairly poor family, but she was a sharpshooter at early age. And she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, where her marksmanship astonished audiences. As Mark Gardner said, there was a feat that she would do in these audiences where she would use a mirror. She would put her Winchester rifle on her shoulder, and she would shoot the tip of a burning cigarette, off of her male partner in these shows. And boy, I could not imagine being him. Can you, again, think about that? Late 1800s, and you let this woman do a trick shot with a real bullet where she would shoot the end of your cigarette right in front of your face. Anyways, she was known for feats like, again, shooting a cigarette out of her husband's mouth, splitting playing cards on edge. Throughout her career, she advocated for women's rights and promoted responsible firearm use, yada, yada. Jesse James, I'm going to read more about Jesse James. He's in my Outlaw section. Wyatt Earp, he was the famous lawman, again, at the OK Corral shootout. Born in Illinois, Wyatt Earp worked variously as a buffalo hunter, gambler, and lawman. He is best known for his role as a lawman in Tombstone, Arizona, and his involvement in the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral. Earp became a lawman in Dodge City, Kansas, before moving to Tombstone. In 1881, he and his brother, along with Doc Holliday, engaged in a shootout with the Clanton and McClure brothers, who were suspected cattle rustlers. Earp survived the battle and became a symbol of frontier justice. Now, his brother was later killed. He was ambushed by these same cowboys and was killed. And this is where Wyatt Earp kind of goes off the rails. And even though he had this reputation as a lawman, he was very frustrated with the way that the judicial procedures worked in the Wild West. And so when these cowboys or these criminals or outlaws were accused of a crime, usually they worked with a gang of other men. And so they would go to court, and whatever cowboy or outlaw is being accused of something, and many times it was actually true, they would have their men come and provide an alibi. And because the court depended on testimony of people, firsthand testimony, they would be found innocent of various crimes. Wyatt Earp was so fed up with this that after his brother was killed, he went and then personally killed the people that were responsible. Wyatt Earp is remembered as one of the greatest lawmen of the Wild West. His life story, filled with adventure and controversy, symbolizes the struggle to establish law and order on the frontier. Doc Holliday, again, we heard a little bit about him. He was actually a certified dentist. Very interesting man. And we're going to listen to Mark Gardner talk a little bit more explicitly about Doc Holliday. Very interesting. And it's his personal, Mark Gardner, the historian, is one of his personal favorite figures of the Wild West. He was born John Henry Holliday in Georgia. Doc Holliday was a dentist turned gambler and a gunfighter. Despite suffering from tuberculosis, he lived a daring life and became close friends with Wyatt Earp. Holliday's involvement in the gunfight at the OK Corral made him famous, known for his quick temper and deadly aim. He played a significant role in the shootout and became a feared figure in the West. He is remembered as a gambler, a loyal friend, and a man who lived on his own terms despite a terminal illness. And Doc Holliday's friendship with Wyatt Earp and his role in the OK Corral shootout made him a legendary figure. He represents the darker, grittier side of the Wild West, embodying both the thrill and danger of the frontier life. And then, as I said, Sitting Bull, I also added 2 Native American figures, because you can't really talk about the Wild West without talking about some of the Native Americans. And so he was a Lakota Sioux chief. Sitting Bull was born in what is now South Dakota. Again, Sitting Bull is very important for the Battle of Little Bighorn. He became a respected leader, uniting the Sioux tribes in resistance against U.S. government policies that encroached on native lands. Sitting Bull played a pivotal role in the Native American resistance, most famous at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where General George Custer's force were defeated. Later, he was forced onto a reservation and toured briefly with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He was killed during an attempt to arrest him from allegedly supporting the ghost dance movement. And he is a symbol of Native American resistance. Even today, he's still a very popular figure in Native American circles. As a resistance to U.S. expansion and the defense of a traditional ways of life, his leadership and his victory at Little Bighorn remained a defining moment in American history, illustrating the strength and resilience of Native American culture. And then another figure is Geronimo. Maybe some of you aren't as familiar with him. He was born in present-day Arizona. Geronimo was a leader of the Apache tribe who fiercely resisted Mexican and American forces that encroached on Apache land. His life and legacy: Geronimo was a skilled warrior, leading numerous raids and evading capture by the U.S. Army for years. He surrendered in 1886 after decades of resistance, was held as a prisoner of war for the remainder of his life. Later, he became a public figure, attending the 1904 World's Fair and riding in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. Geronimo's resistance symbolized a sort of Native American resilience and the struggle to defend ancestral lands. Now, this was kind of my favorite, was getting into the outlaws, like some of the most famous outlaws. So obviously, first and foremost is Jesse James, and his brother Frank James. So his background: Jesse James was born in Missouri. He was a Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War. And after the war, he turned to crime, leading the James Younger gang in a series of daring bank and train robberies. Bank robberies. The gang first known for his bank robbery was in Liberty, Missouri. In 1866, Jesse's gang became known for targeting banks, especially those believed who were aligned with Union sympathies in states like Missouri, Iowa, and Kentucky. Train robberies. In 1873, the gang committed one of the first major train robberies in Adair, Iowa, where they derailed a train and looted its safe. Reputation as a Robin Hood figure. Now, did he actually give money back to the poor? I didn't find conclusive evidence of this, but he certainly developed a sort of mythos in the American psyche as a Robin Hood figure. Newspapers, particularly pro-Southern outlets, portrayed Jesse as a Robin Hood-like figure fighting the wealthy elites, although little evidence suggests he actually shared his spoils with the poor. And his legacy: Jesse James was shot in the back by Robert Ford, who was actually working with the U.S. government. This was the U.S. government worked in tandem with Robert Ford to kill Jesse James. And he was actually a fellow gang member. And in 1882, ending his criminal career, his life and crimes have been mythologized, and he remains a central figure in American folklore as a rebellious anti-hero. Billy the Kid, we got introduced to his that tin print of him. He was actually right-handed. He was born Henry McCarty, and Billy the Kid grew up in New York, but moved west as a child. He became a notorious outlaw in New Mexico, participating in the Lincoln County War and gaining a reputation as a deadly gunfighter. Some of his criminal activities and notable crimes is obviously the Lincoln County War. Billy became involved in the Lincoln County War, a violent conflict between two factions vying for control over the county's economy. During the war, Billy and his gang, known as the Regulators, participated in several gunfights, allegedly killing Sheriff William Brady. Escapes and murders. Billy the Kid was known for escaping jail multiple times. He allegedly killed up to 21 men, though historians believe the actual number is closer to 8 or 9. I have seen some people that believe in the 21 number or somewhere around, but I don't know. I also found multiple scholars say it's and that's where Mark Gardner, his opinion was that it was somewhere around 8 to 12. But reputation as a charming outlaw: Billy was young and charismatic, gaining fame as a folk hero in the Southwest. His reputation was enhanced by tales of his clever escapes and skill with firearms. His end, Billy the Kid was shot and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. His legend has grown over the years, and many stories exaggerating his exploits and painting him as a rebellious youth standing up against corruption. Butch Cassidy, another very interesting figure in the Sundance Kid. Robert Leroy Parker, known as Butch Cassidy, and his partner Harry Longenbaugh, the Sundance Kid, led a gang called the Wild Bunch. They were known for robbing trains and banks across the American West. Criminal activities, notable crimes, train robberies again, like Jesse James. The Wild Bunch carried out a string of train robberies, including the infamous 1899 Wilcox train robbery in Wyoming, where they blew up a safe and stole thousands of dollars in cash. Now, I didn't catch a number on how much Butch Cassidy had, but in regards to Jesse James, I did find a number that in today's wealth, at least a couple of years ago, it would have been somewhere in the ballpark between $6 to $7 million that Jesse James and his brother Frank James were able to steal. The James Younger gang, $6 to $7 million was the total. I'm not sure about Butch Cassidy, but the bank heist. They also robbed banks, including the Bank of Montpelier in Idaho in 1896. The gang was meticulous in planning, often hiding out in remote hideaways after heist. And that was part of his reputation, is that unlike Jesse the James, or maybe I shouldn't say unlike, but most specifically to Butch Cassidy, is they planned meticulously for any of the crimes that they were going to accomplish. And this was one of the reasons why they were able to escape the law for so long. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were known for their likable personalities, and some accounts suggest they avoided violence whenever possible. Their charm and style helped romanticize their image. And as Mark Gardner highlighted when the video we were watching, that Jesse James and his brother Frank James, he said, Jesse James, you could be talked out. If he said he was going to kill you, you could probably talk him out of it. But if Frank James said he was going to kill you, he was going to kill you. Their end and legacy: in 1908, they allegedly fled to South America, where they reportedly died in a shootout in Bolivia. Their story, especially as portrayed in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, has added to their legacy as two of the most charismatic outlaws in American history. Bella Starr, this was actually a female, notorious female outlaw, born Myra Maybelle Shirley. Bella Starr was a notorious female outlaw who associated with several infamous criminals. Again, Jesse James. She was known as the Bandit Queen, and she operated in Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. She did horse theft, so Bella was involved in horse theft and bootlegging, operating her ranch as a sanctuary for outlaws on the run. Her home became known as a haven for criminals. Close ties to outlaws. Starr was associated with the notable outlaws like Jesse James and the Dalton brothers. I have them on this list as well, leading to her targeted by law enforcement. Reputation as a female outlaw, Bella was known for her defiance of traditional gender roles and her involvement in outlaw culture. Her flamboyant personality and alliances with male outlaws contributed to her legendary status. And she was shot and killed in 1889, possibly by a former associate. She is remembered as one of the few prominent female outlaws. So John Wesley Hardin, another important figure. Again, you look at these dates, see how they all kind of end at the end of the 19th century. Known as one of the deadliest gunfighters. Again, Mark mentioned John Wesley Hardin. That deadliest gunfighters in the West. Hardin claimed to have killed over 40 men by the time he was 21. He's the one that shot. He was in the hotel and shot a man in the other adjacent room because he was snoring. He was raised in Texas. He became involved in cattle wrestling, gambling, and gunfights from a young age. His criminal activities. Hardin's violent reputation began with his alleged killing of an ex-slave at the age of 15. He was involved in numerous gunfights and became notorious for his ruthless efficiency with firearms. He escaped prison multiple times, repeatedly pursued by law enforcement. He was finally captured in 1877 and sentenced to prison for murder, where he spent over 15 years. Reputation as a cold-blooded killer, known for his temper and willingness to kill at the slightest provocation. Hardin's name became synonymous with violence and mayhem. He often justified his actions as self-defense, but he was widely feared. And again, after his release from prison, Hardin briefly attempted to practice law before he was killed in a saloon in El Paso, Texas in 1895. Again, reputation is one of the most violent figures of the Wild West. And then the Dalton Gang. I don't know how many of you guys have ever heard of the Dalton Gang. The Dalton Gang was composed of 4 brothers, Bob, Grat, Emmett, and Bill Dalton, who initially worked as lawmen but later turned to crime. They became known for their brazen bank and train robberies. The Dalton Gang attempted to rob 2 banks simultaneously in Coffeyville in 1892, hoping for a massive payday. However, the townspeople recognized them and engaged them in a gunfight, killing most of the gang members. The Daltons conducted several successful train robberies, but they became greedy, eventually attempting the Coffeyville heist, which led to their demise. The Dalton Gang was known for its ambition and willingness to take risks. The Coffeyville bank robbery was a legendary example of their audacity. And then Black Bart, this was the last one, and then we'll move through the document. We'll get back to Mark Gardner here in just a second. Charles E. Boyles, known as Black Bart, was a notorious stagecoach robber in California and Oregon. Dressed as a flour sack mask, he gained fame as a gentleman bandit who left poems at his crime scenes. Very, very interesting. Black Bart committed at least 28 stagecoach robberies between 1875 and 1883 using an unloaded shotgun. He would often give the driver a chance to escape without violence. His poetic calling cards and several robberies, Black Bart left poems behind taunting Wells Fargo, the target of his heists, and adding to his mystique as an educated, nonviolent outlaw. His reputation, Bart was known for his polite demeanor and lack of violence. He was never fired a shot during his robberies. His refined style made him an unusual and intriguing figure in the Wild West. And he was eventually caught in 1883 and served 6 years in prison. His reputation as a gentleman bandit endures, and his poetic style sets him apart from others. Regards to the religious and cultural context of the Wild West, I was kind of interested in this. And there's a significant Catholic presence because of the Spanish heritage of the Southwest. So Protestant and Catholic missions made their way to the West. There's obviously a Mormon influence in Utah, not as significant, but there were people coming, especially the circuit riders that sort of catalyzed some of these tent revivals and calling people to repentance and communal worship and stuff like that. That's what I found. And then diverse religious practices and cultural fusion. Of course, you already had Native American spirituality at the time, where there was intense syncretism, especially amongst the cowboys and many of these cattle herders between Spanish, sort of European American and Native American cultures. And then folk beliefs. Many settlers brought folk beliefs, including superstitions, healing practices, and herbal remedies, which influenced their daily lives. Cultural life, as I said, it's rugged individualism and self-reliance, diverse populations and mixing. You have Chinese, Mexicans, African Americans, and then various European immigrants, all in the same area, vying for land, vying for money, vying for opportunities. And then outlaws and historical figures. These kind of the 3 cultural significant points that I had of the Wild West and the impact of the Wild West on the American psyche. I kind of presented this stuff in the opening, my opening monologue, but Manifest Destiny, the expansionist mentality, the rugged individualism and the frontier spirit, conflict and romanticism, and then the cultural syncretism and American diversity. All this is why the Wild West and the West in general still plays such a prominent role in the American psyche. Because as I said, it symbolizes somebody who is self-reliant, somebody who seeks freedom and liberty, somebody who determines their own destiny, somebody who's going to sort of face whatever comes, face the extraordinary resistance of nature and other peoples to sort of manifest that which you believe is rightfully yours. And that really does characterize modern American entrepreneurial spirit and why we celebrate entrepreneurs, I would argue. Major threats faced by westward travelers, obviously disease. I found some of the most prominent diseases for some of these Western settlers was cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, smallpox, and scurvy were the most common. And how people dealt with these diseases, often isolation and quarantine. They got various herbal remedies and folk medicine from Native Americans, boiling water and food safety. Eventually, they figured about dysentery is that you need to boil all the water you get from these stagnant places, these water sources. And then adaptation to native remedies. Like I said, Native American medicine greatly influenced how they dealt with diseases in the Southwest. And then food shortages, challenges, of course, limited supplies, lack of game and foraging difficulties, spoilage, those types of things, how people dealt with food shortages, hunting and fishing, trading with Native Americans and forts, food rationing and creative cooking. Pioneers made do with what they had, finding ways to stretch their resources. For example, flapjacks made from flour and water provided a basic bread substitute. And then conflicts with Native Americans, of course, environmental hazards, how people overcame them. And so, again, this whole document, guys, will be available at my website. It's for $5 a month. And so if you want to read all this whole document in more detail, feel free. That's what it's there for. It's just a $5 a month subscription. And if you just use this link right here, you can get access to all these show notes that I've already done, including the last like 8. So that link is right there. Anyways, let's get through here. So I put together a timeline from the beginning with the Louisiana Purchase. So this is all the exploration of moving west in America. So you get the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804 to 1806, the Missouri Compromise, Indian Removal Act, Texas Revolution, and then the Oregon Trail. Is where you get the Donner Party and stuff like that, as we mentioned earlier. And then we get the Manifest Destiny and Western settlement. That's where I said you could say the West begins in the 1840s, although I really like the mass movement post-Civil War, but you could certainly say it began in the 1840s and make a very convincing argument. So the Manifest Destiny, coined by journalist John L. Sullivan, coined the term, promoting the belief that Americans were divinely destined to expand across the continent. This ideologically fueled expansionist policies and immigration. As I said, part of the American experiment, the American project, I'm talking about all the way back to, like Roanoke, like the early colonies before America, before the Revolution. This land was perceived by especially the British as the opportunity to fulfill and create the second Eden. It was going to be a sort of the millennial kingdom. That was the belief that this land was going, and that's still, you can see how that would influence the Manifest Destiny and Americans believing that, there's only opportunity and positive benefits despite the struggles if we move westward. It still colors the American psyche today. 1845, the annexation of Texas, as we mentioned earlier. 1846, 1848, the Mexican-American War, California Gold Rush, Fort Laramie Treaty, and then the Colorado Gold Rush, 1859. Here's where it really starts to take off. 1861, 1865, the American Civil War. Then 1862, the Homestead Act. It allowed settlers to claim up to 160 acres of land for a small fee, provided they improved the land by building a home and farming it. This act brought millions of settlers to the West. And again, that Homestead Act, I thought, how cool would it have been, right, to go to Colorado or Arizona or parts of California, Montana, wherever, and kind of find and set up shop, find your ideal 160 acres, build your house, plant some crops, and by law, it's yours. Obviously, Native Americans didn't find that too exciting, but I think for us Americans, it would have been. And then you get the Pacific Railroad Act, 1862. This was huge in regards to the transmission of goods out to the West Coast. You have the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad by 1869, the Battle of Little Bighorns, 1876, just to give you a sort of time period here. And then this is where the iconic Wild West period is. So it's 877 through 1890. You get the Nez Perce War, gunfight at the OK Corrals, 1881 in Tombstone, Arizona. 1886, the end of the Open Range. The Dawes Act, 1887. The Dawes Act aimed to assimilate Native Americans by breaking up reservations and allotting individual plots of land, ultimately stripping tribes of communal lands and traditional lifestyles. You have the Oklahoma Land Rush in 1889. and then 1890, the Battle of Wounded Knee. Now, just look at these dates. Isn't it amazing how recent all this stuff is? Like, I love history. And to me, I'm blown away by my research here into the Wild West and how recent it is. I mean, our country is only about 250 years old. Like 2026 is going to be 250 years. We are just a blimp on the historical timeline. And to think of all the interesting stuff that's occurred in this country since then, I think it's fascinating. And by the 1890, we're seeing the closing of the frontier. And so 1890, the census declares the end of the frontier. The U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier was effectively closed as settlements had spread across the continent. This announcement symbolized the end of the unbroken Western wilderness. Turner's frontier thesis, historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented the frontier thesis, asserting that the frontier experience had been central to shaping American democracy, individualism, and the national identity. You get the Reclamation Act in 1902. Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907, and Arizona and New Mexico become states in 1912. Like, I know about how recent Hawaii became a state, but isn't it fascinating that the continental United States wasn't even complete until 1912? And so I have a whole section here on the importance of railroads and how that influenced the West and shaping it. Clothing, this was a section I put together that I found was pretty interesting, and looking at the clothing. So shirts, materials, and design. Cowboys and other typically wore long sleeve shirts made from durable materials such as cotton, wool, and flannel. That's why I got the flannel on today. The flannel and the denim, right? This is Americana Western attire here. I don't have the cowboy hat and I don't have the spurs and boots, but I do have the denim and the flannel. And these shirts protected their skin from the sun, wind, and elements while allowing for breathability in the hot, dry climate. Plaid and striped patterns were popular, and some shirts featured reinforced shoulder seams to add durability, all that different stuff. Trousers and denim jeans, contrary to some myths, denim was indeed worn by cowboys, but primarily towards the end of the 19th century. Levi Strauss, German immigrant, his jeans really got going in 1873. Chaps, obviously we know they wore chaps. Hats, they had wide-brimmed hats. Hats were essential for protection from the sun, wind, and rain early on. Many cowboys wore bowler hats, which I was not aware of because of how durable they were. The bowler hat was popular in the West before the classic cowboy hat took hold. And then we have the Stetson. This is the classic cowboy hat. In 1865, John B. Stetson created the Boss of the Plains hat, which became the standard cowboy hat. It featured a high crown and wide flat brim, providing excellent protection from the elements. Stetson hats became highly popular due to their durability, practicality, and adaptability. Footwear, cowboy boots, obviously spurs, vests and coats. So they were very common. Vests were widely worn and were valued for their pockets, which were useful for carrying small tools, money, and tobacco. They provided a layer of warmth without restricting movement, while making them popular among ranchers and cowboys. Duster coats, wool coats, and ponchos. Bandanas and neckerchiefs, popular, and they were highly practical and multifunctional. Cowboys wore them around their necks to protect against dust and sunburn, and they could be pulled off over the face during dusty conditions during cattle drives. Accessories and tools, belts and holsters, obviously. Pocket watch, it's a real thing. Pocket watch were very common accessories for cowboys and settlers who needed to track of time during these long cattle drives. The watch was typically kept in a vest pocket and secured with a chain. Clothing adapted from other cultures, again, Mexican, Native American, and immigrant influences. And then my last section, which we're not going to cover, you can read all this at the website if you want. Native American counters, again, how they really were trading and bartering to begin with. And then the tensions began to escalate with broken treaties and moving on to native lands. And I just have a list of some of the important battles and stuff like that. So,
outlaw in the Old West. Well, there's several candidates. John Wesley Hardin maybe killed as many as 24 men. He's the one you might have heard of that killed a man just for snoring. He heard a loud snoring through the thin wall in this hotel and fired several shots, and he stopped snoring. But I just think Jesse and Frank James are a little scarier. I would vote for them as the most dangerous. Jesse and Frank had come out of a very vicious, horrible civil war. One of their leaders was called Bloody Bill Anderson, and he actually hung Union soldiers' scalps from his bridle and saddle. And after the war, because they'd become so numb to that violence, it just didn't bother them to kill somebody. And there were lots of innocent victims in their robberies. You either opened up the safe or you got shot, and they were serious. One man who knew them said, if Jesse said he was going to kill you, you could probably talk him out of it. But if Frank said he was going to kill you, he was going to kill you.
And then the next one, so we're going to be skipping. We're not going to listen to each one of these questions. But in regards to the shootout at the OK Corral, he answers, which film did it better? So here's his thoughts.
Or Wyatt Earp. Which film did the OK Corral scene best? I feel like the Wyatt Earp, Kevin Costner version is a little more accurate in that it has the gunfighters much closer together. They were literally within a few feet of each other. The Tombstone movie with Kurt Russell, it's a very big lot. And actually that lot where the gunfight occurred, estimates are as small as 15 feet across. So it's very tight, very compacted. One thing that I liked about both films was that they did pull from the historical dialogue that was taken down in witness testimony after the OK Corral gunfight. That one famous line where Doc Holliday tells one of the Baclares, he says, "You're a daisy if you do." Well, that actually was what he spoke at the time. But the one thing that really stood out to me was that they have the Earps and Doc Holliday pulling guns from holsters. Wyatt Earp pulled his revolver from a coat pocket. Doc Holliday pulled his revolver from a coat pocket. It was very common at that time to have tailors make pistol pockets in your coats. It said that Wyatt Earp's pocket was actually lined with canvas to ease a revolver coming out of that pocket and not catching the hammer on your coat. Users watching a Western the other day, and they had to check their guns to come into the city. Made me think, did the Old West have stricter gun laws than we have now? They did have very strict gun laws in the towns or the cities. Places like Tombstone, Wichita, and Dodge City, these are big cattle towns. They're driving huge herds of cattle in. The cowboys are getting paid off. They have guns. It's dangerous. So these communities had city ordinances preventing the wearing of guns, preventing having concealed weapons. Only lawmen were able to carry their guns. It's a very dangerous occupation for a lawman to disarm drunken cowboys. So these cowboys, when they came in with their guns, they had to check them. They had to drop them off at a certain location. And then when they were leaving town, they could pick their guns up and take them back with them. But they could not be wearing firearms while they were in these city limits.
And then the next question I wanted to share with you guys was the old saloon drink menu. So what kind of drinks did they have back then?
Saloons have anything else to drink other than whiskey and beer. Cowboys must like a fancy drink every once in a while. All these boom towns, whether it was Dodge City or Deadwood or Tombstone, they had well-stocked bars. And we had lots of...
And look how well-stocked that bar is. I mean, he wasn't joking. Imagine, again, how remote some of these places were. Like Tombstone, Arizona it was just a territory. It wasn't even a state of the United States. And he's going to talk a little bit more about the variety of wines and whiskeys. And at one point, we're going to listen to the cuisine of the Wild West and how some of these places were so wealthy due to the cattle trade that they had fresh oysters every day. And that oysters were actually a very common delicacy in the West. But check out that bar for something that's so remote. I mean, that really does look like a movie set.
Lots of photographs, and you can see all different types of bottles, whether it's wine or champagne, brandy, gin. In 1874, there was a book published, The Bartender's Guide, that gave you how to make cordials, juleps, the more elaborate bars, and there were many. Could just make any drink that you had a hankering for. Javert Hugo.
So sorry, guys, we can't watch the whole thing because this is copyrighted, so we got to click through some of these sections. So this one was really interesting as he's asked, when did the Old West officially end? And I was looking at this question as well, trying to find answers. And there's a wide variety of speculation depending on which academic you talk to. It seemed like the general consensus was once barbed wire fences became more normalized in the West. So these giant territories with cattle, at one point, these landowners, especially in the 1890s, began to put up fences. And once they put up fences, the job of the cowboy, the job of these people moving, thousands of heads of cattle at a time, isn't really necessary anymore. And because of the railroad system and its expansion, they really don't have to drive the cattle as far as they used to, and they can kind of just set up ranches next to the railroad stations, or the points in which the meat trade is going to occur. Because when the railroad, so during the, Chicago's known for like meat packing, right? And so during the Civil War, Chicago was essential for feeding Union soldiers. Much of the meat was being processed through Chicago. Well, once the Civil War ends, it kind of dwindles down a little bit, but what now, as the railroad gets to the West Coast, and especially towards the Rockies, now they can ship all this cattle and all this meat all the way to Chicago, and it really starts up the meatpacking industry again. So anyways, I digress. But here is his thoughts on when did the Old West officially end?
When did the Old West officially end? Just saw Colors of the Flower Moon, and it takes place in the 20s, but still feels very much like the late 1800s. Well, that's a great question. Some people might say the buffalo. When the buffalo are no longer free-ranging, when barbed wire fences are stretched across the plains, there are no longer cattle drives, that could be the end of the Old West. But to me, it's when the automobile takes the place of the horse. Maybe that's the 1930s or 40s, but when there's no more horses on the streets, then to me, the Old West is over. Jed Houston.
And that was an interesting take, because he is a prominent historian. Based on what I was reading, he's written multiple books on the Old West. And so I thought that was interesting. For him, he characterizes the end when the arrival of the automobile, which you begin to see in the 1930s in places in California and some of these larger cities out west. That's a much later date than many of these other scholars. Many of them point towards basically the end of the 1890s, and they point towards the arrival of fencing. They point towards mass immigration towards the West, Americans moving westward, and just the job of the cowboy no longer being needed. But for Mark Gardner, for him, it's the doing away with the horse. And I find that pretty interesting, because people like Butch Cassidy, there's something so freeing about the horse, even more so than the automobile, because for us Americans, and this is another thing very different from the European mind. I remember being in Greece with my Greek friend, and he lived in Saris, and we were going to Orianopoli, which is the city you go to before Mount Athos. And it was probably maybe a 2-3 hour drive. I can't remember exactly, but somewhere in that range. And for them and the Greeks, they thought this was a long drive, this was a day event. And for us Americans, driving 2 hours or 3 hours, that's not that big of a deal, because the country's so big, we're so used to it. And so there's a sense of freedom with the American automobile. But on some of the things I was reading, the horse, because you didn't need a road per se. And so like somebody like Butch Cassidy, who robs all these trains, does all this crime in the United States, eventually they flee down to South America, and he's killed in Bolivia. But the fact that they got down there by horse, they traveled everywhere by horse. And many of these people that would rob trains and stuff, once they robbed them, with the plains, places like Nebraska and Kansas, if you had a horse, you could easily get away, especially if you had a head start on law enforcement. So very, very interesting thought that kind of came to me through all this. And then here's him talking a little bit about Annie Oakley. So if you guys are familiar with Buffalo Bill and his sort of Wild West circus, if you will, and we're going to talk more about Buffalo Bill here in a little bit, but one of the the sharpshooters of his show was Annie Oakley. Very interesting little tidbit he puts here. And then he talks a little bit about Billy the Kid, which I want to show you guys.
Wait, Annie Oakley was real? Yes, she was real. Annie Oakley was the real deal, too. She was an excellent marksman. She had a partner. She would look at the mirror, had the gun over her shoulder. He'd have a cigarette in his lips, and she would shoot off the end of the cigarette. It seems very dangerous. Buffalo Bill Cody, the Wild West exhibition, traveled really around the world. One of the big draws for Buffalo Bill Cody's show was these stage recreations, whether it was a buffalo hunt, whether it was an Indian attack on a wagon train, a robber's attack on a stagecoach, the cavalry. They got to see Sitting Bull one year. Sitting Bull was well known as a leader of the Lakotas. They actually could see this person they read about, see him in the flesh. I mean, it was quite an experience. Very, very popular, and it went for decades. At Minonock said,
this is really interesting. He's talking about Billy the Kid. If you guys are familiar with who Billy the Kid is, he'll introduce him. But this was a renowned outlaw and sharpshooter. And so here we go.
Says, what do you mean? Authenticated photo of the real Billy the Kid was only found in 2011. Well, there is only one authenticated, and it existed a lot before 2011. It says here, this is a tintype that was made at Fort Sumner of Billy the Kid by a traveling photographer. We don't know who the photographer was. And there's something you have to know about tintypes. Tintypes are reverse images. And if you look in this image, you would think that Billy the Kid was left-handed. In fact, there's a movie with Paul Newman called The Left-Handed Gun. That's the story of Billy the Kid. He's called the left-handed gun because of this image. But because we know that tintypes are reverse images, actually, Billy has his pistol on his right hip. So this is the image corrected the way that it should be. And actually, this is an enlargement of the tintype. The actual tintype was the size of this tintype. It's very small. And the reason it's called a tintype is because the photograph is actually made on tin. The emulsion is on a very thin piece of tin. Technical name, ferrotype. And the reason we know that this photo of Billy the Kid is authentic is because it was identified as Billy the Kid in his own lifetime. It appeared in the Illustrated Police News while he was still alive. A few years ago, this actual tintype, the one that's in this image, this sold at auction for $2.3 million. So that had a huge effect because when a small tintype brings that kind of money, people are going to start looking for other pictures of Billy the Kid. So in recent years, there have been a lot of photos. They have some kind of a resemblance to Billy the Kid, but you just can't identify a photo based on resemblance. You have to have some kind of provenance that links it to Billy the Kid. There's a picture of supposedly Billy the Kid playing croquet. These are wannabe images. There's no connection with that image to Billy the Kid. At JC Meow.
Okay. And then next question that I thought was interesting. He talks about black cowboys. We already addressed that. Branding cattle. Popularity of the 10 gauge shotgun. I thought this was interesting.
Shotgun so popular in the Wild West? Did they just want things extra super duper dead or what? Well, they did want things dead. So if you've heard of the Stagecoaches, if you heard of Wells Fargo, the shotgun messenger, he sat next to the driver and he held a 10 gauge shotgun. And that's where the phrase comes that you're riding shotgun. It was also manufactured with a shorter barrel. When the gun goes off, the shot is going to spread quicker at your target. It's going to be very wide. If you're riding shotgun and you got a couple of robbers up there, you want a big pattern and hopefully knock them out of commission. There were two other firearms very popular. One is the Winchester repeater. You might have heard of the model 1873. It is a lever action weapon, so it fires several rounds each time you work the lever action. The other weapon that also fired several rounds is the Colt single action Army revolver. Sometimes they called the Colt the Peacemaker because that ended any kind of arguments. It has 6 chambers. You tried not to put a bullet in the chamber underneath the hammer because if the gun dropped, or if you knocked it against something and the hammer went into the cartridge, it could go off. So most cowboys, most lawmen, they rested the hammer on an empty chamber so that they wouldn't have any kind of accidents.
How accurate was Red Dead Redemption, the video game, to the actual Wild West?
How accurate is Red Dead Redemption? I think it's as accurate as an average to good Western. One thing that always stands out to me in that game is the way the men wear their guns in their holsters. It's the Hollywood holster rig. They have the holsters really low down on the hips for the fast draw. But in the actual Old West, they had them riding up very high. I mean, it's easier to get on a horse if you got the holster up high on your belt. It seems like there's also a lot of action in a campground. And a campground was actually kind of a common thing. If you're just arriving at a location or town, well, you're going to be camping on the outside of town before you get settled in. That's what the Earps did when they came to Tombstone. They didn't initially have a place to live. Ebica asks.
So there you go. Red Dead Redemption, other than the way that the gun held, does have some relationship to the historicity of the Wild West. He talks a little bit about literacy rates and that there's a misconception that many people in the West were illiterate. Not the case, actually. They had many schoolhouses, and even adults would teach other adults how to read. So even though there were some people that were illiterate, many people that made their way westward were actually literate, some better than others. But even some of the outlaws who didn't have formal education could still read or write. And so he mentions that. And then here's the one on shootout etiquette. As I was talking to you about, they didn't exactly wait for each other. So here's this
in the Old
section.
West and was in standoffs, I wouldn't wait to shoot. I'd shoot right away. Why did they wait? It's literally a contest to shoot the other guy first. Well, they did not wait. There were not these Hollywood standoffs between gunfighters. Normally, these guys are taking pot shots. They're trying to assassinate or ambush him. If you're dealing with a murderous individual who's adept at firearms, you're not going to give him a chance to kill you. Perfect example is with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett was not going to give Billy a chance to gun him down, to draw his gun. When Billy the Kid steps into the darkened room at Fort Sumner and says, "Key&S, who is it?" Pat Garrett recognized his voice and he opened up. He fired 2 shots. The first shot hit Billy in the chest and Outlaw Billy the Kid was no more. The only time there was actually really a classic standoff was at the OK Corral. At Morkinsome comment, I would not survive in the Old West. Pork and beans is just grim. Well, it wasn't just pork and beans. There was actually pretty fine dining. In the boom towns, cattle towns, they actually had oyster saloons. In Dodge City in the 1870s, there was one saloon that advertised fresh oysters daily. These would be packed in barrels, and actually oysters could last for a few weeks before they spoiled. So as long as you had a wagon train or stagecoaches, actually get fresh shipments in each day. But if you're a cowboy and you're with the cattle herd out on the range or driving the cattle from Texas up, well, you got fresh beef on the hoof, so you can have fresh beef. But beans were popular because they stored well. I mean, they're dry. If you're on the trail, you want foods that are going to last quite a while. So each cattle drive had a chuck wagon. The chuck box had flour, dried beans. The cooks, he's got Dutch ovens where he can actually make biscuits, cornbread. There was a little bit of variety there, even on a cattle drive. At West ask, who is your favorite Old West gunfighter? Now that's tough. I always had liked the look of Wild Bill Hickok because he had this flowing long hair. It's curly. He was a snappy dresser. And then he had those.
Wild Bill Hickok, unlike many, for example, Jesse James and his brother Frank, who were former Confederate soldiers, Wild Bill was actually a Union soldier and a sharpshooter. So a little bit of an interesting tidbit there.
2 pistols pointing forward, what they call the cross draw, and they're pearl handled or ivory handled. But I think he's edged out for me by Doc Holliday. Doc Holliday had a dental degree. He was a heavy drinker. He could be very belligerent. And then he has this great friend, the greatest lawman in the West, Wyatt Earp. The reason they're friends is because Doc Holliday actually saved Wyatt Earp's life in Dodge City. Optiplex 9000 asks, what was there to do in a saloon in the Wild West? Did people just drink? Was there any food served or activities hosted by the owner? There were all kinds of things going on in a saloon. Some saloons, of course, had eating establishments connected to them. They actually had lunch counters. In the 19th century, lunch wasn't the standard noonday meal. If you were having lunch, it meant a snack or a small meal. In Tombstone, Arizona, there was a saloon called the Oriental, and it had chandeliers, and it had the Brussels carpets. It had these elaborate carved wooden back bars with large mirrors. Some of these saloons actually had a reading area where they stocked magazines and books, and so you could enjoy that while you're taking a break from the faro table. There were actually brothels that coexisted in these communities along with saloons, and prostitution was going on. You often had a situation where a gambler had a girlfriend or significant other who was a prostitute. One of the unknown things about Wyatt Earp, he actually worked in a brothel. He was a bouncer, and he also might have been a pimp himself for a short time. He did this in Peoria, Illinois as a young man. Gracely wants to know, what are some lesser-known facts about the Old West that might surprise?
We'll watch this section too, but one of the things about the brothels, based on some of the research I was getting into, is that for women, obviously a lot of these cowboys and people moving out west, not as many women out there. And so women were highly sought after. But at that point, women mostly did domestic work. And so they could often do washing laundry and stuff for an hourly wage or a daily wage. But they could become a prostitute, especially in one of these boom towns, these major cattle cities. Again, Dodge City. And I got a bunch pulled up here. Let me see. So Tombstone, Arizona, Dodge City, Kansas, Deadwood, South Dakota, Virginia City, Nevada. These were major boom towns for the cattle drive, and cowboys were there, and they had big cities. And so these women could become prostitutes, and they could make as much that a woman made doing laundry in a week, they could make in one night. And it was interesting to hear some of the stories about these young women, beautiful young women that would become prostitutes. Some of them would get married. Many of them would not. They would be sort of lifelong prostitutes. When the Chinese immigrants came, even the Chinese men actually sold many of the women to these brothels and stuff to be used for prostitution. But for young women, unless you came from a family that kind of already had some money, it was hard for them to find a husband. So once they became of age, they had to sort of make a decision. Were they going to maintain their purity and wait out for a husband, which again, there's plenty of men out there, but maybe not the type of men they were looking, or were they going to become a prostitute? And for them, prostitution was a very lucrative business. And again, you think, going back to G. Bailey's comment with the World Wide Web and the internet, we think about pornography. Well, it kind of touches on the brothels and the importance of those in the Wild West as well.
Surprised most? Well, one thing that might surprise most is there actually was more than one Billy the Kid. We always think of William H. Bonney, Henry McCarty, alias the Kid. There was actually a Billy the Kid in Tombstone, Arizona at the time of the OK Corral. If you look at the prison records, you'll find a lot of people that had the nickname or went by Billy the Kid. Another thing that's not well known and actually kind of eerie involves the outlaw Jesse James. Jesse James was very superstitious, and he claimed to see a ball of light, what we might call or refer to as ball lightning. Some people call it swamp gas, and they were kind of an omen. Something big was going to happen. He saw this light before the Northfield raid, where the gang was defeated and driven out of town by the townspeople. And he also saw it a short time before he was assassinated by the Ford brothers. Wonder why the saloon doors in the Old West were designed the way they were. I've looked at lots of photos of saloon exteriors, historic photographs, and I haven't yet come across one with these swinging doors. Usually it's just a regular door or large door. My suspicion is that these swinging doors were very convenient for movie makers, because you can see someone coming in and out. The swinging door you can see right away. That's Wyatt Earp, that's Wild Bill Hickok. So I'm guessing that's kind of a Hollywood thing, those swinging doors. Fun fact, some of these Old West characters, figures, made it out to Hollywood. And some of these early silent films had these Western legends, these Western characters on set advising. In fact, some of these individuals even appeared in the background scenes of some of these films. Ask, which Native American tribes were the most fearsome and formidable foe the U.S. government faced, and why? So there are several nations in the American West. In the Southwest, we have generally the Apaches. On the Central Plains, we have the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. Down here in Texas and the Southern Plains, the Comanches. And then up here on the Northern Plains, we have the Crow and the Lakota. The Crows became allies of the U.S. government or the military. But, that question, which is the most fearsome or formidable, you have to remember they're all fighting for their culture, for their life ways, for their people. Who wouldn't be formidable or ferocious if you're trying to protect your families? And that's certainly the case with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. They refused to sign treaties. And that put them on a collision course with a man named George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry. I didn't realize how well made Navajo blankets were in the 1800s. That history of living off the earth with bare essentials was amazing. Well, it truly was. And we've got a Navajo blanket right here. The Navajos were making blankets as early as the 1600s. They learned to make blankets apparently from the Pueblo Indians, who had long been making blankets. They're made on a vertical loom. It's a very tight weave. The Navajos eventually raised their own sheep so they could have their own wool, and it became an industry that exists to this day. So this is a pipe bag. This tells us that the North American Indians on the plains were involved in a global market economy. This decoration are glass beads that were made in Italy. They were transported here in trade with the Plains Indians for their buffalo robes. The buffalo robes are being shipped to Europe. The North American Indians are getting brass kettles. They're getting firearms. I mean, they're tied into the entire world, and it's reflected in this. They learned to live off the land. What nature provided them, they made very good use of, and at the same time, they made it beautiful. At Ico Rich asked, when does the Old West start? And he's got a poll. So one option here is Lewis and Clark. 1803 to 1806, the core of discovery. Lewis and Clark are sent out west by Thomas Jefferson to really explore the Louisiana Purchase that they've just acquired from France. They're looking for a transportation route. We've got mountains, plains. There's an unexplored country. Is there a way to get across it? They're introducing some of these indigenous populations, these Indian nations, to the United States. Lewis and Clark brought with them peace medals. The Indians were used to getting peace medals because of Great Britain, France, and Spain. And so the United States, well, we have to have our peace medals to impress these leaders of these Indian nations as well. Another is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And that is how the United States acquired from Mexico what we now call the American Southwest. This is the whole chunk of land that's acquired through that treaty. So that's another option, is the beginning of the West, or at least according to the poll. We also have the end of the Civil War. You have a lot of Civil War veterans that go west. But we also have here the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad stretches all across the plains and across the Rocky Mountains, and it allows a migration of people, passengers, to take the trains all the way across the country. In a way, this term you heard, manifest destiny, that the United States was destined to expand from ocean to ocean. The railroad completes that idea, that theory. So those are all really good suggestions. I kind of like the end of the Civil War for that classic period of the Old West.
And that was my general takeaway from the research I did. It's really the end of the Civil War to really the 1890s, that iconic period of the Wild West. Again, Mark said that he would identify with the beginning of the car and the doing away with horses in the street. Fair enough.